Welcome back to HOA Underground. You know, they say a man's home is his castle, but in suburban America, there's usually a dragon guarding the gates. And that dragon usually wears a beige cardigan, carries a clipboard, and goes by the name of Brenda. For 2 years, I lived in a state of constant psychological warfare. I was fined for the color of my curtains. I was threatened with legal action because my grass was a quarter-inch too high. I was the HOA's favorite target. Brenda, the HOA president, thought she had finally cornered me. She thought she was about to take my home. She stood on her pedestal and smiled as she delivered what she thought was the final blow. But Brenda made one fatal mistake. She assumed I was playing her game. She didn't realize I was playing by a set of rules written 70 years before she was even born. I let her think she won. I let her gloat. I let her humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. And then, I showed her the land title. Stick around, because today's story isn't just about a dispute. It's about a total, absolute legal demolition of a suburban tyrant. It started in the spring of 2024. I had finally saved enough to buy my slice of the American dream, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet cul-de-sac in Northern Virginia. The neighborhood was perfect. Tree-lined streets, quiet neighbors, and a massive, lush backyard that bordered a small wooded area. When I closed on the house, I saw the HOA paperwork. Standard stuff, or so it seemed. I'm a quiet guy. I pay my bills on time. I keep my trash cans out of sight. I figured as long as I wasn't painting my house neon pink, I'd be fine. I was wrong. Enter Brenda. Brenda lived 3 houses down. She was the president of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. To Brenda, the HOA wasn't just a committee, it was her kingdom. And she was a queen with a very specific grudge against anyone who didn't bow down. The trouble started when I decided to install a high-end cedar fence in my backyard. I had 2 young golden retrievers, and I wanted them to have a safe space to run. I followed the HOA bylaws to the letter. I submitted the architectural request, I used the approved materials, and I waited for the mandatory 30-day approval period. I heard nothing. Silence. According to the bylaws, if the board doesn't respond in 30 days, it's a deemed approval. So I hired the contractors. The fence was beautiful. It added value to the property. It looked professional. 2 hours after the final post was hammered in, my doorbell rang. It wasn't a welcome to the neighborhood plate of cookies. It was Brenda. She didn't even say hello. She just pointed a shaky finger at my fence and screamed that it was a violation, an eyesore, and that I didn't get approval. I calmly explained the deemed approval clause. I showed her my time-stamped emails. She didn't care. She looked me dead in the eye and said she was the board and that the fence had to come down by Monday, or she'd make sure I regretted ever moving there. That was the beginning of the notice era. Over the next 6 months, I received over 40 violation notices. Fines for unauthorized landscaping because I planted marigolds. Fines for commercial vehicle parking when my brother visited in his work truck for 2 hours. $50 a day for a non-compliant mailbox. I tried to attend the board meetings to appeal, but Brenda ran those meetings like a military junta. She would mute my microphone on Zoom or lose my physical request to speak. The other board members were just her puppets, neighbors she had bullied into submission. The community started looking at me like I was a criminal. Brenda had started a whisper campaign, telling everyone I was a difficult homeowner who was trying to tank the property values of the entire street. But then Brenda got greedy. She didn't just want my fines, she wanted my land. Brenda's property backed up against the same wooded area as mine. She had always wanted to extend her patio, but her lot was too small. She realized that if she could rezone the HOA common area boundaries, she could effectively claim a 15-foot strip of the woods, which happened to be right behind my house. She sent me a final notice of foreclosure. The claim: I owed $12,000 in unpaid fines and legal fees. She claimed that since I hadn't paid, the HOA was exercising its right to place a lien on my home and begin the foreclosure process. Along with the notice was a boundary realignment survey she had commissioned using HOA funds. According to her new map, my beautiful cedar fence was actually 10 feet onto HOA common ground. She told me she would drop the foreclosure if I agreed to sign over that strip of land to the HOA and tear down my fence. I was at my breaking point. I felt like I was losing my mind. I sat in my darkened living room looking at the piles of yellow envelopes, thinking I was going to lose my home to a woman who was mad about marigolds. I called my uncle, a retired real estate attorney. I told him everything. He listened in silence for 40 minutes. Then he said to send him my closing documents, all of them, including the historical title search. 3 days later, he called me back. He wasn't angry. He was laughing. He told me that Brenda had just handed me a loaded gun, and she didn't even know she was standing in the firing line. I spent the next 2 weeks at the county records office. I went deeper than Brenda's $500 an hour HOA lawyer ever bothered to go. Oak Creek Estates wasn't always a suburb. In the 1950s, it was a massive family farm owned by the Miller family. When the farm was sold to developers in the late 70s, it was carved up into lots. However, there was a specific legal retainer in the original deed. The original farmhouse, the house I now owned, was the master parcel. When the HOA was formed in 1982, the developers made a massive clerical error. They included my lot in the HOA boundaries on the map, but they never legally amended the master deed of the Miller farm to grant the HOA jurisdiction over the actual land title. In plain English, my house was a donut hole. The HOA surrounded me, but legally, my property was an enclave. I was never part of the HOA. The membership I signed at closing was legally void ab initio, because the HOA had no authority to encumber the master parcel without a specific unanimous historical waiver that didn't exist. But that wasn't the best part. The woods Brenda wanted, the common area she was trying to steal, that wasn't HOA land either. According to the 1954 land title, that strip of land was an irrevocable private easement belonging solely to the owner of the master parcel for the purpose of agricultural access. Not only did she have no right to fine me, she was currently sitting in an HOA office that was partially built on my easement. I waited for the annual general meeting. This was the big one. The whole neighborhood was there, over 200 people in the local community center. Brenda was at the front, looking like a CEO. She was wearing a power suit, ready to announce the successful foreclosure and the expansion of the community green space, which was really just her new patio. She got to the disciplinary actions section of the agenda. She said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy, that despite their best efforts to work with the homeowner of Lot 42, the violations had become untenable. She announced they were moving to foreclose, and the boundary realignment would proceed to protect the interests of the community. She looked at me in the third row and asked if I had any last words before they voted to ratify the legal fees. The room went silent. I stood up. I didn't have a lawyer with me. I just had a single blue-backed folder. I walked up to the podium. Brenda tried to stop me, saying I wasn't on the agenda. I leaned into the microphone and told her that since I wasn't a member of the HOA, her agenda didn't really apply to me. The crowd started whispering. Brenda laughed and said I signed the papers. I opened the folder and pulled out a large, color-coded map from the 1950s and a certified copy of the master deed. I announced to the room that according to the Miller Farm master deed from 1954, Lot 42 was specifically excluded from the HOA's restrictive covenants. The developers messed up the paperwork 40 years ago, and for 40 years, nobody noticed. I turned to Brenda. Her face was turning a weird shade of gray. I told her that meant every fine she issued was mail fraud, every lien was a slander of title, and that her foreclosure notice was an illegal attempt to seize property she had no jurisdiction over. The HOA lawyer snatched the papers from my hand. His face went pale. He whispered something in Brenda's ear. Brenda snapped, screaming that those woods were common ground and they were building a trail there. I smiled and told her those woods were my private easement. And according to the survey, the HOA clubhouse we were standing near encroached 6 feet onto my land. I told her I didn't owe her $12,000, but that she owed me 60 months of back rent. The meeting descended into chaos. The neighbors realized the Queen was powerless. The board members voted to remove Brenda as president immediately to avoid personal liability. I sued the HOA for $250,000. Because I had the original land title, they didn't even want to fight it. They refunded every fine with interest and issued a formal apology admitting they had no jurisdiction over my home. Brenda put her house on the market 6 months later. She couldn't stand seeing me every day. sitting on my unauthorized cedar deck, looking at my perfectly legal marigolds. Let this be a lesson to all the Brendas out there. You can have your clipboards and your power trips, but the law doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about the title. I let her think she won because when you strike at a Karen, you'd better not miss. I didn't miss. If you enjoyed this story of suburban justice, hit that like button and subscribe to HOA Underground. Until next time, keep your grass green and your titles clear.